thanks to all of you for coming out to this event. My name is Mark Thomas, and I work up at York University. I'm director of the Global Labor Research Center, which is one of the co-organizers of tonight's event, along with the Socialist Project and the Center for Social Justice. Before we get started, there's a few things I want to announce, and the most important of which being that tonight's featured speaker, Emmanuel Ness, is coming, but he's not here yet. To get started, tonight's event was really organized around this new book from Emmanuel Ness called Southern Insurgency, The Coming of the Global Working Class. And Professor Ness will be here shortly, we hope, to give his discussion of this book. But to get a conversation going and to push the issue and explore the issue deeper, we put together a panel of discussants who are going to share their thoughts and reflections on the topic as well. And so that's where we'll start tonight. So we have Professor Viviana Patroni, who is an associate professor of international development studies in the Department of Social Science at York University. And she'll speak first.
I could just remind you of some of the main issues in the book. I would say probably the main objective of the book is to show the transformative potential of the newly emerging industrial workers in some of the export sector, producing for exports in countries in the global south. This potential, though, and that's probably the interesting part in the conversation, is in some cases stated against their traditional unions, as these unions have not been able to respond to the particular needs and demands of workers in export processing zones in particular. The book is also a good reminder of the our incapacity to understand the global economy without having a good understanding of the way in which labor comes into being around production for exports. And so the main object of analysis in the book are the experiences in 3 countries in the global south around workers' struggles that again has been stated against, in some cases, the desire of their own formal unions. And so these struggles have been directed in many ways, in many cases against the state, capital, and also against formal labor organizations. The global in the title, I was a little bit unclear about it, but I suppose evokes the connection that exists between these workers and the international and the global circuits of capitalist accumulation. But there is another way of conceiving it. At some point, when I started to read, I imagined global was also going to refer to the extension of some of these struggles and connections globally. But that doesn't really happen in the story, or at least I didn't see that happen. So the book is ambitious in scope in the sense that these are 3 very distinctive countries, and it's there probably that I would like to start to point at some tensions that I see in the analysis. So probably to say it in a different way, 2 areas where it would be nice to have to further our conversation and understanding. The first area where I thought it would be good to have a conversation is the fact that we know these are obviously very large countries. India and China together represents 1/3 of the population and probably half the population of the global south. But nonetheless, there is probably a tendency in the book to overgeneralize the experience of these countries, and it seems to me that there is a pressing need to understand better the trajectories that countries in the global south has undergone under neoliberal globalization. Differences were very important before, but I think that they have changed dramatically now. And I think that this is important because some of the alternatives that have emerged to development have some of the countries in the global south as leading forces in the transformation. But if we don't see exactly their position in the hierarchy of these global processes of accumulation, it becomes difficult to see the commonality of interest, but also obviously the tensions among countries in the global south. So the book, in some ways, and the analysis of these case studies assumes that they are representative of some more global transformation in the global south. But yet, for example, there has been equally important, it seems to me, there has been the process of deindustrialization in the global south too, that has generated its own dynamics and problems in terms of unemployment and the informal sector. But is not analyzed, and it seems to me that the problem is probably more serious because countries like China and India, and not to mention South Africa, are countries that have experienced already a process of industrialization. So industrialization for export is not the first experience with the industrialization in these countries. And so in some cases, so then that these cases would actually speak of an industrial conversion that has happened under globalization. The second area of tension, and this is where I have the main points, where Emmanuel uses these three cases to chart the alternatives and experiences that he studies in terms of organizing, alternative organizing in these countries. The more effective case has been China, regardless of the complete monopoly of the state-sanctioned union. That has given it probably a capacity to go under the radar, and workers have been able to organize very effectively. The other case is the case of South Africa, where there have been an emergence of alternative unions in opposition to the more co-opted and corporatist unions that existed. And finally, the case of India, where there has been the movement has been able to escape the interest of the main labor movement, but not of the state, and therefore repression has also been very high. My problem with this and the cases that are interested is that there is probably not enough contextualization of these cases. So it is difficult to see the relevance of these struggles and the sectors where the workers labor in the context of the economy as a whole. Therefore, we have very little to evaluate the potential of these struggles to become something bigger over time. And so it is in relation to this that I would like to raise 3 points. The first is that we are constantly given the numbers that we are provided are absolute numbers, the absolute size of the working class, right? We know that. But it seems to me that just as important is, in the case of, for understanding these case studies, is also to know the proportional weight of these sectors and these workers vis-a-vis the economy and as a whole. And there is very little discussion about that, and again, I couldn't find it. So these manufacturing sectors for exports in the global south, in particular, a problem that seems to me very relevant is that they have not been able to absorb nearly sufficient labor as to transform the internal dynamics of labor markets in these countries and the relative power of workers and their unions. This has been the case even in the most successful cases like South Korea or Brazil, but it's also the case in China. And so I would just follow here Peter Evans' suggestion based on official statistics, showing that actually the peak in the growth of industrial labor in China was toward the end of the 1980s, but already by the 1990s it was declining. And it was always much smaller than the quantity of workers employed in service and in agriculture. And this period is the period where industrialization had actually happened in the Northeast under the control of the state, and then we see the transformation of this industrial base toward the Southeast and under the control of multinational corporations. And then we see a lower capacity for labor absorption, and this coincides with the period where China's exports, industrial exports, actually increased fivefold. So if we look at then industrialization historically, and it's not different with what is happening in these export processing zones, industrialization and industrial production is capable of absorbing every time, if you look at historically, less and a smaller proportion of the working class. This is not, to put it in a manner terms, it doesn't make the working class redundant, but it certainly shows that the tendency has been for technology to become more capital intensive, even in the industries that has been transferred to the global south. Connected to this problem then, is the issue of the size of, so we have then on the one side then very small working classes, even when industrialization has proceeded very fast in these countries. This connects to the second problem I want to raise, and that's the size of the informal sector. The book has a whole chapter dedicated to immigration, and part of that obviously has been the important immigration that took place in most countries, in several countries of the third world, from rural to urban areas. So the process of urbanization in most of the third world or the global south coincides with the growth of very large informal sectors, and these were people moving into the cities completely dispossessed from other means of making a living, and it was in the informal sector that they found ways of surviving, of kind of negotiating a living. Now, the informal sector has always been very large in the global south, but it grew even more, starting in the 80s with restructural adjustment, the very unstable rates of economic growth and lower rates of economic growth compared to the period before. And so what we have then again is the further growth of the informal sector. That has been, so by the turn of the century, I give you a few figures, so like in countries of North Africa, and these are aggregate figures for region, obviously there is a lot of country variation, but just so to give you an idea, about 50% of the working class, of the workers, people, of the labor force, reproduces itself within what we call the informal sector in Northern Africa and in Latin America. The figure is 72% in Sub-Saharan Africa and about 65% in Asia. So these are the enormous sectors of the economy, enormous portion of the working class. And we need to see then this as a second challenge in terms of thinking of the industrial and this very particular industrial working class and its capacity to generate a process of organization and actually to be the trigger of the new wave of labor unrest in the global south. Finally, and I want to also mention that the lines between formal and informal economy have become increasingly blurred, and we had the case, for example, of a very large portion of the working class actually working in conditions of informality within the formal economy. So that you consider all these and everybody working in more precarious jobs, but within the informal economy, then the informal sector is even larger and more relevant to our analysis. But so what are the political implications of this? And this is my last point, and I know I am running out of time. That there is, it seems to me, when you put all these together, there are very important political questions that we need to ask about. First of all, the capacity of the working class to generate a political response, to do it by itself, as opposed to thinking of a political project and the role of a party and a movement. But I want to raise the issue that it has been very difficult for traditional labor unions, and this is, I think, is a big challenge, is to think of workers in a broader sense. And in general, I think the tendency has been to think of workers as those receiving a wage. And I wanted to probably raise this as a possibility, that we need to enlarge our understanding of the working class. And I'm going to read you a very brief quote from Michael Denning, who says, the proletarian is not synonym with wage laborer, but for dispossession, expropriation, and radical dependence on the market. You don't need a job to be a proletarian. Wageless life, no wage labor, is the starting point in understanding the free market. And I think that this is probably an idea that I have found very compelling, to think of the ways in which we need to transcend the limited way in which we have understood the working class and the possibilities for organization. And therein lies the challenge for the labor movement beyond particular sectors, but to think of this enormous chunk of the labor force outside what has been the realm of labor organizing as also being fundamental in thinking of an alternative for the working class. So I leave it.